So it's a great pleasure to have Konstantin Lifschitz here with us at the University of Hong Kong. He's here on a marathon. He's playing all 32 Beethoven piano sonatas in about 10 days in 8 concerts. So that's quite an amazing feat. So Konstantin, having now got all these Beethoven sonatas into your system, into your being, I mean, do you have a new view or understanding of Beethoven or these works?
Well, definitely. Well, first of all, I would like to start with thanking Hong Kong University for giving me this incredible opportunity to perform all these 32 here for a fantastic audience. Of course, this is already the 3rd time I'm doing this cycle. I started in Lucerne just to try it out. Then the first cycle was in Taiwan, in Taichung, the new theater there. And now we're doing this in Hong Kong, and then I'll be doing this in Taipei. So of course, every time I have to go through the cycle, it takes pretty much all of my imagination, power, energy, whatever. So this is certainly a life-changing experience, just going through this incredible soul, incredible brain of this unique mind, unique creative power, which Beethoven really was. It is impossible to stay the same person when you do this.
When you take on a task like this one, I mean, you have to go through all this music. I mean, do you feel that the score is the score and the dynamic, because he's very particular about dynamics, and you just have to play the thing, or is it much more taxing than that, and that this whole cycle has taken a lot of your creative energies?
Well, certainly so, because when you think that Beethoven was, I mean, we're taught this way that we have to take every comma and every dot that Beethoven wrote quite seriously. And there is truth to that, of course, but that's not the most important aspect and the most important problem in Beethoven interpretation, is that very often we have to deal with just the first editions, and there is no manuscript for actually more than half of the sonatas. So that's already difficult to decide whether that was really Beethoven's decision to phrase or to put that or this dynamic in his score, and he was notoriously known for being unhappy with his editors and sometimes furious at times. Also, where we have the manuscript, it doesn't mean, it's very tempting to consider manuscript as the last Beethoven's work. Well, whereas very often it is not. It is just a preliminary sketch, really. What people think this was really the Beethoven's vision and his idea about how music should be performed. So there is that aspect. And another thing we should not forget, when Marie Bigot, this famous French pianist, came and played Beethoven's music, and he was so mesmerized and loved her performance, and he actually gave her the manuscript of the Appassionata. That is why that piece is kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France today. And his explanation, his praise to her performance was exactly that she was not very truthful and not very faithful to his text, but she made, without being dogmatic, she made really the spirit of his music, of his ideas, to come out best. He puts it in wonderful words. He says in a letter to somebody, he says that she found exactly that compromise between being over-sentimental and being too rigid. So of course those Scylla and Charybdis, these two big problems that we face unavoidably when we deal with this music, is something that is very challenging, is very taxing, very hard.
Yes, and lots of, you have to do a lot of interpretative work, not just because you can't decide what Beethoven wanted in some cases, but also just the music itself is demanding a lot of your interpretive energies, right?
But of course, even the notes themselves, let alone the phrasings and dynamics and the articulation, the notes themselves, for example, in Hammerklavier Sonata, we have in the little fugue, D major fugue, we have very ambiguous notes, and sometimes we don't know, is this a natural, is this a sharp? And of course, if you play sharp instead of natural, this is a totally different character to the whole phrase and probably to the whole piece. Yes. In a way.
So big decisions have to be made.
So the big decisions have to be made, and those decisions keep changing. You cannot let them entirely depend on your moods and where you play, what kind of audience you perform for. So you have to be very flexible and very open and let the music somehow tell you instinctively what to do today, and that would be the valid experience for both the performer and the audience.
Yes, yes. Now that you've mentioned the hammer clavier, maybe we can talk a little bit about the late sonatas, because you'll be playing them in a few days' time, in fact, all in one day. And, you know, when you have this experience of going through this Beethoven piano sonata landscape, I mean, when you get to these late works, I mean, do you feel there is a difference here, or we just call them late because it happens to fall later in his life and it's just an arbitrary thing?
Well, people generally like to label things. I'm not sure that Beethoven himself was aware, and it was an issue for him if he finished his early period and started his so-called heroic middle period, and then dismissed that and was disappointed with what he's done in, let's say, Eroica Symphony or the Fifth Symphony, and turned back to that kind of music writing and started to do something entirely different. So for people it's kind of easy to follow these three distinct patterns, but of course each and every sonata for piano or for piano and violin or the symphony and so on, I mean, in fact the whole Beethoven's heritage, from one piece to another this is a different period. So for me we can either think of 32 different periods when we talk about 32 sonatas, or we can talk about one composer creating, evoluting from first sonata to the last one. So this is something that is, for me, very hard to define. And the more I deal with this music, the harder it gets.
Right, each one seems to have its own world, right? Its own particular universe. Yeah. With the ones that you're playing on Sunday, I think, beginning with Opus 90, I mean, there is a sense, I think, sometimes in these works by Beethoven where he seems to be less sure about the answers, because a lot of what we would call the heroic works are very certain about, yes, that's how it is, right? Whereas here I think there is a sense in which he's not really giving you answers, right?
Yes, but that's true. But if we look one sonata behind, is the Le Bévol famous Les Adieux sonata, which is the one before the Opus 90. I will be performing this on Saturday. When you think of that piece is dedicated to the departure of his beloved Archduke Rudolf, who was his main sponsor and his piano student. So of course during Napoleonic Wars the Archduke had to escape from Vienna, and Beethoven composes this sonata. First movement is called Le Bévol, so Farewell. The second one is the Absence, and the third one is the Return. Of course when he was composing he wasn't sure if the Archduke was going to return. He wrote nevertheless a very, very cheerful, exciting, ecstatic last movement about his return, but within this movement, amidst this movement, we hear this very menacing, very or rather terrible calls, so to remind that this is just in my imagination he's coming back.
Right.
I'm not sure if he's coming back, if he's going to support me anyway. Am I going to see this person again?
Right. Can you illustrate that moment?
And so on. Yeah. So this gives us a little bit already insight in his later work, even though this is officially still the heroic Beethoven. Yeah. Of a composer who relies primarily upon his imagination, and not on the formal. He tries to observe the formal rules of music writing, as he got it from Haydn and from Mozart. But of course, here we have anticipation not just of the whole 19th century, the early Romantics, the late Romantics, but also pretty much of the 20th century. So I don't think any composer in the 20th century, I mean, I'm talking about the big composers who were so incredibly different between themselves, such as Stravinsky, Hindemith, Bartók, the second Viennese school, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and so on. Of course, all these people could never ignore Beethoven, at least one of the aspects.
Yeah, almost pivotal in the Western
for
history.
some it was the tonal aspect, for the others the rhythmic aspect, the structure aspect, and so on. So of course they would probably need to hate Beethoven, but they couldn't ignore Beethoven.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's interesting we talk about the sonata talks about the return, right? Because in a way, after that sonata, there was a kind of gap where Beethoven was writing a lot of political works, not really his best music, maybe in a way, and then so things begin to return, right? The piano sonata begins to return, but it comes back. It's not quite the same. In a way, I think you already sense it in Opus 90, but Opus 101, the A major sonata, already a little bit unusual in many
really
ways.
Gives us a sort of a shock when we first deal with this. Actually, it starts with the two sonatas for piano and cello, Opus 102, actually composed before Opus 101, but around the same time, 1815, 1816. So that's really the gate into the late Beethoven. Even though, like I mentioned, I don't like that description.
Right. The gate into something different.
A gate into something different. A gate into something that was even more drastically different from one sonata to another than it was before.
Right.
Gate into Beethoven, not so young anymore, the composer who questions everything he had done before, writing very ambivalent, very ambiguous music that is very seamless, very hard to describe. I mean, he tried to kind of pinpoint his ideas with that sonata Opus 81A, which I mentioned, the Farewell Sonata.
Yes.
And then he realized he sometimes would use a phrase, or he's very meticulous also in his descriptions, the character's description. Just the opening page of the last movement of Sonata Opus 110 has at least 17 different indications. So it gives us an idea that the composer is really trying to find the right means, right words to describe what he's striving after, and also somehow showing us that he's not sure whether he's going to fail with that or not.
Yeah.
So
Can you maybe demonstrate with us, maybe with the A major Sonata Opus 101, where you feel this kind of ambiguity, this kind of searching quality lies when you play this?
Well, just look at the first chord. The sonata is officially in A major. We don't hear an A major until probably the third page, pretty much the end of the movement. So it starts all around the A major. So the A major kind of floats around. We can smell it, but we don't see it. E major, which is what we started with. Of course, there was also not something particularly new for Beethoven. If we look in the famous recitativo from the Tempest Sonata, Sonata Opus 31, number 2, the second recitativo in particular, it is supposed to be in F minor. We don't hear a single time the main key, the note F. It's a dominant to it. And then we hear but there is no sense of F minor. That's exactly what Beethoven is avoiding. Actually, I think this is one of the most challenging and difficult aspects in the interpretation and the performance for us, because Beethoven is never hitting the point. When he uses lots of dynamics, because his music is so dramatic, obviously, but with his dynamics, when he writes this, crescendo, diminuendo, there is no moment where we can say, okay, this is really the high point. He always puts it in the most awkward place, if you think of that. And by doing this, he avoids this clarity over articulation of his intention. He always leaves it a little bit in the shade. Right,
and yet there's a sense in which that Opus 101 sonata is one that begins, all the way to the end, right? And part of that sense of being out of kilter all the time is because he wants to keep it, the secrets at the end.
That's why that was also the favorite movement of Wagner. That was really for him the prototype of the endless melody.
Yes.
Which he was so fond of. And of course not just Wagner, but all the romantics, they would simply not happen without Beethoven, especially without the late Beethoven. It's another challenge because it's all too easy to perform Sonata Opus 109 as Schumann, Opus 101 as Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn based his sonata pretty much on that model, in fact, or hear Brahms in the slow movement of the Hammerklavier and so on. Of course, we can hear what Beethoven kind of arrows he was sending into the future, but he has to remain very different.
Of course,
yes, and of course that incredible sense of measure and proportion that was only his. That is something we need to try to grasp.
So how do you think in that sonata Beethoven really sort of starts something mysterious at the beginning? Because it comes back, the first movement, right?
Yes,
in a sense. But then it resolves, it sort of, does it clarify itself? Or?
Well, the opening, the exposition which I just played, the second phrase of it. So this phrase, with this incredible octave leap, is something that we will not hear until it comes back in the third movement of the piece, because when we come back to the recapitulation, he avoids that beautiful phrase and goes straight sort of second subject. And when it comes back after the very meditative, very sorrowful, emotional introduction, very quiet and static one, so again Beethoven is revolving around the dominant, and then he comes to this big dominant chord, and we hear kind of a cadenza. Around that chord, and then after this incredible return of the thing, there's a long fermata, and then we get as a bonus the return of the, and not just we get it, but now he starts to work around it. Finally he hits the dominant, which and then the finale is so impressive with the tonic, because now the dominant finally
Finally the tonic chord arrives, yes.
Right. Geschwinde, doch nicht so sehr, und mit Entschlossenheit, so very decisively, with lots of decision. I think that is a very central aspect to Beethoven, decisive, not decisive. Because when we look at the portrait of Beethoven, mostly he would be portrayed as in the moment of great decision making. And many people think that he's the great decision maker, which in fact he was anything but. So Beethoven is all about being indecisive. So those moments are the release of everything else. And we have maybe 1 or 2% of Beethoven where he really kind of shows us the way and sounds very victorious, very optimistic. And then immediately he questions that, especially in his later sonatas.
Right, it's always this, must it be? It must be kind of, it be kind of questioning that happens. And of course that fugue, in many ways, sort of foreshadows another fugue that's going to be in the next sonata. So there's this thinking about fugues now that Beethoven has.
He called this first sonata for Hammerklavier. So officially the first edition even said new sonata.
Yes.
Neue Sonata. So he wanted to underline that this was a totally new way of composition.
Yes.
A bit like Dante's Vita Nova. So,
yes.
new life, new life of the sonata. But also the last sonata, Opus 111, is the notoriously the end of classical sonata.
Yes,
so
it has that reputation.
What Schubert and Schumann and Chopin did, and Brahms, with that form, was something that could not be achieved. Had nothing to do with the classical sonata anymore.
Do you feel that the fugue at the end of Opus 101 and then the one in the Hammerklavier, the Opus 106, are very different, or do you see it one leading to the other?
I think the one that really leads into Hammerklavier is the fugue from the cello sonata. And so on, the last movement. That is really the big preparation for Hammerklavier. The one in Opus 101 has a different function, because that's in a different key, and it fills the development section of the finale, which is the real sonata movement of that piece, even though the first movement is kind of sonata, but he plays around with it just like he does in Opus 109. He uses a fugue in many different functions, so not just as form making. In Opus 110, the two fugues, they show this conflict. The first fugue is very confident. It's like somebody who decided that he got an answer after the first Arioso dolente. We hear the fugue, which gives us a lot of support and feeling that we know the way. So of course, when the fugue comes like a mirage after the second Arioso, he destroys the first fugue in a way. So again, we see the composer who is not at ease with himself, who is always saying yes, but.
Yes.
Always this yes and no.
Especially with Opus 110, where those two fugues are from, where, yes, here's a very sad song, this Arioso, and here's my confident fugue, and now my song is even more destroyed, right? And now my fugue, how do we pick up from there, right? So with the Hammerklavier then, that's such a difficult piece, I think, to understand, right? And it's so massive a piece. How do you sort of get your mind around that piece? How do you interpret what's going on in a piece that it seems so gigantic, so sublime, and so that fugue is just like nothing you've ever heard before in a fugue, right?
Of course, and nothing you will ever hear thereafter. I mean, it has its completely own place, not just in musical history, but in the history of what human mind was capable of. He uses every possible device of the fugue so that you don't even notice that. Anyway, this piece is, of course, maybe the most esoteric one, along with the Diabelli variations. Very difficult to put into words and explain what it is about. We, as performers, we have to deal with this on a daily basis, because we can't say, okay, we have some foundation to start to build our concert upon, because that doesn't work here. Like what Beethoven shows with the two fugues in Opus 110, the moment you believe you found something, he's showing us how this is nothing, how this is turned into naught. And the same is with Hammerklavier. The appearance, the facade of the piece is a very, very imperious one. That's actually the first time he starts a sonata with a fortissimo. As a matter of fact, the first sonata which he even starts with forte is number 25. If you think he starts his sonatas always very, very quiet, out of nothing. So the Opus 79, the number 25, is the Presto alla Tedesca, which is first playing around with something. So Tedesca is a German dance, Ländler, Deutsche. He uses the Italian word, and for the first time he writes for. So that's the first opening of this kind, and then the second one is the Hammerklavier with fortissimo. So really presenting the piece with the face immediately,
Right.
putting us in media res, so to say, immediately in the action. Usually he is very, very cautious
Yes.
with his preparations.
Yes, it usually builds up to the action.
builds up-
Whereas
he builds
this
up
one,
from nothing.
it's a terrible beginning for any pianist, right?
Yeah.
They have to do that leap. It's almost a heroic act in itself to
Yeah.
do that. And so it
It's
begins.
it's easy when you're sitting alone in your room, but when you have the audience, immediately you get panic. Am I going to make it?
Yes. But you see that as a facade.
Yeah, that's just a facade, because when we look at the theme 2, which is in a very distant key of G major, of course. Immediately we see the composer dealing with this kind of Tochter aus Elysium, so this unearthly creatures, and trying to write something so opposite to the opening, which seems to be so robust and so down to earth in a way. So he writes with he starts with this facade with the two phrases which are sort of repeat themselves on a new level. The early sonata, Opus 7 again. Then we have immediately fermata without sound, and the next phrase puts this in question. So many stops immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So he gives us this dual idea pretty much in the first 30, 40 seconds of the piece has not even begun yet. Yeah, we immediately have this puzzle.
Yes.
How can we deal with this? Is this that, or
Right.
was that the Hammerklavier sonata, or is this Hammerklavier sonata? We all like to have clarity and inambiguity in our life. We want to say or hear yes or no. But Beethoven never says yes and no. It's always there's this German word jein. Yeah. So this kind of two faces, one yes and one no.
And in a way, the whole sonata tries to kind of play with this yes-no issue, right? You got his last piano sonata scherzo, which is again full of this yes-no kind of dissonances, right? And then, of course, the extraordinary, massively long, slow movement, which seems to arrive at this moment of transcendent light. And then the fugue. Again, the beginning of the fugue, the introduction.
The introduction.
Yes, no, yes, this one, that one, maybe. And then something that seems very decisive, but is the fugue another facade? I mean, how do you play this? How do you pull off this fugue? I mean, what's your...
Well, that's another one where he writes risoluto, so that's the same as we had in Opus 101, Mit Entschlossenheit, the decisive, resolute composer who now knows his way. But of course not for long.
Yes.
Again, even though it has these cosmic proportions to it, but after the things get on the verge of unbearable, the chaos, he writes the fugue con alcune licenze, with certain freedoms. I mean, he was quite modest to say just some freedom. This is all about creative freedom, this fugue. Even though it deals with this very strict polyphonic devices, such as the fugue being reversed or played upside down, and so on, augmented, diminished, and doubled, stretto, everything that belongs to a proper fugue.
Dislocated rhythms as well.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And then all of a sudden he comes to this A major outburst. And the caesura that comes is very uncomfortable one, because obviously composer doesn't know what to do next and gets lost. And then we hear this kind of second fugue, you can call it second subject, or second fugue, una coda. Between the two fugues of Opus 110. So there is some energy, there is some power, but yet it is very, very shaky, very fragile in a sense, and only when the both themes get connected to each other. Still pianissimo, but we can see. Fugue, second theme of the fugue totally transformed into something very massive, very heavy. So we see the artist in work all the time.
Yes. We were talking earlier about this fugue and how you felt that in a way you had to let it play itself. That one of the keys to playing this difficult finale is to almost wind it up and let it go.
Yeah, that's of course the most challenging moment when he, in this introduction, when he gets from slowest possible tempo, largo, this is the slowest tempo in Beethoven's vocabulary, and he goes to prestissimo, which is the fastest one, so he starts really very statically. And so on, and then gets are so exhausted by this introduction, let alone the slow movement, which is almost 20 minutes long before, and then you have this fugue in store, and that's a moment where it's not for a faint-hearted, because it's so easy to say, no, I'm not going to make it, and that's just the beginning of it. So when you that turning point. Then the fugue starts, the subject starts. So this is this takes a lot of courage and a lot of decision, so to say, resoluto.
The last three Beethoven sonatas are completely different in scale to the Hammerklavier. I mean, they feel like much shorter in a way, like very condensed, and yet I always feel with time in these sonatas that somehow, even though theoretically they're very short, they seem massive on the inside, that, you know, if you play these works, it's like they just expand and expand and expand and expand, and so that you're in almost two different timescales, an internal timescale and an external one. So on the CD it's like, you know, 20 minutes or something, but actually it feels like you've been in this space for much longer. I mean, do you what is Beethoven doing here with time and form and so on?
Well, for example, if we start with the very first movement of the Opus 109, which is barely 3 minutes long, maybe 2.5, we basically have two different movements within one. One is called Vivace ma non troppo. Adagio espressivo, totally different world, like a second movement already. Two characters, they intermingle, and that makes this 2.5 minute movement feel like 20 minutes, because we're dealing at the same time with two different situations all the time, and it's hard also for the listener. And then this first movement goes seamlessly in the second one, which is called prestissimo, another prestissimo with Beethoven, and actually in the same key of E minor. This was that movement is also very, very short and very condensed, not because it has these two characters, but because it is opposed to the first one, and it interacts with the first movement very closely, and there's a lot of friction, so to say, between these two movements. And then the last movement really is a long one, it's over 15 minutes, the variation set. Kind of classical variation style, but already the theme is so different from anything, any classic theme that Beethoven had used up till then, even if you look at the Appassionata and other variations in his sonatas. So this kind of incombinable, very different pieces, like using many different styles together.
Right,
And
like
that's
being in
what
lots of different time zones.
Yes,
Almost.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And then your most, what you call the perfect sonata, which is for you, opus 110, the
No, I
A
don't
flat.
think it is for me. This is not my objective.
It's not your objective.
Preference. It's not the one that I want to buy because I like it better than any other. But from the many points of view, formal, intellectual, and first of all, just the spiritual, emotional, feeling, energetic aspects, this is really probably the most perfect sonata. It is astonishing that after Hammerklavier, Beethoven could compose these three last sonatas, which have practically nothing to do with each other. I mean, they have some kind of echoes, inner dialogues, sometimes very hidden dialogues. But I think the amazing thing is that he could evolve in such a short time. So, like you say, time zone, like traveling from tropics to tundra.
Yes. And of course, this is a sonata. I think it's Charles Rosen that talks about how if you're playing this sonata, at the end you feel as though there is a kind of physical sort of resurrection almost that happens in your own body as you play it, right? Because it's a sonata where you seem to die. You're required to lose breath, to be sort of almost asthmatic, and then little by little you gather this life, right? I mean, do you feel this extraordinary energy sort of consuming you in this?
It's an incredible feeling, which I can share with Charles Rosen. This something is difficult to describe. You can only experience it in actual live performance.
So do you think there's something transcendent? I mean, it may be difficult to pinpoint, but something that is more than just the emotive or the formal aspect of the music, that somehow the music has hit something that is kind of beyond.
Well, we like Bernstein said that we all love to speak so much about music, and we deprive music of its mysterious qualities. I think this is one of those pieces where it's better just to try to grasp it while playing and deal on a purely musical terms with it, because when we try to pinpoint, when we try to describe it, it's I think it's more of a loss than a gain.
Better to zip up and just come to the concert.
and not zip up. Zip up is again is something very rigid about this zipping up. No, of course, let's use our first ideas. Let's listen to this music like children for the first time.
Right. Without preconceptions.
Yes, I think that's
and let it speak, as it were, rather than... Well, we were talking about how Beethoven, in many ways, asks us more and more to listen, right? Because he was the composer that couldn't hear.
Yes, exactly.
And he wants us to hear, right? And there's a music that says, listen, keep listening.
I think Beethoven was the first composer, even though Mozart said that for him rest is more important than the sound, but it was Beethoven really, especially in his later pieces, with his pauses, really gave such a value to non-sound, almost in a cage sense of the world. I mean, it doesn't have to be 433, but what he does in the beginning of the transition. So it's not these four different keys that are interesting, it's what happens in between. And in between there is nothing, there is silence.
Or resonance, maybe.
Resonance.
Yeah, I think that's one of the... I was always curious that Beethoven would still compose at the piano, right? Even though he couldn't hear anything. And there's a sense in which these late sonatas are some of the most resonant works you can. So those silences, right, are resonant silences. It's like you can listen to this. I don't know what you call it, the space in which the music is just sounding in some sense, and it's almost a composing out of resonance when you get, particularly the last sonata, right? The
because
last
the harmonies are the same as used by anybody. There is nothing that we cannot find in the well-tempered clavier here, as far as the harmony goes. But it's the way Beethoven dealt with that language, the way he rethought what Bach, Handel, and the composers before them were doing. This is really what is so astounding.
Yes, yes.
It's later.
Well, let's talk about the last sonata now, because you mentioned earlier that it was, in a way, also a kind of farewell to the sonata, or the classical sonata. And it's also a piece that has that sense of endless resonance about it. I mean, how do you sort of figure out how this movement, I mean, not how this movement, how this sonata
okay, now the second movement, the last movement of the last sonata, the Arietta, that's the one movement that doesn't have one single rest. The music never stops the sound for a fraction of a second. There is this incredible sense of continuity.
In fact, it doesn't even rest from the last movement, right? Because the pedal is supposed to be right down for the last quarter of the first movement.
Whereas there is plenty of rest in the first movement.
Yeah.
Starting with introduction, after this, a little bit like Hammerklavier, but the opposite way. Immediately we have rest, and then a long one. So again, dealing with pause and going into the second movement without a single pause, without a single rest and silence. And yet the music is all about silence, even though it is always sounding, because Beethoven, like we discussed, is teaching us how to really listen to something, not to hear the sounds, not to hear music. Yeah, we're surrounded by sounds. All our phones are permanently ringing, sending messages and calling and so on. And we hear the announcement in the airport and in the station, but we don't really listen to them unless it is important for us, so we can get information about our flight. And Beethoven really tells us this very important information, not about our flight, but about our whole life experience. And that is something he taught not just musicians, but the whole humanity. And that is ultimately for me the most important aspect in his heritage.
And in a way, the very end of the last movement, often people feel that that's exactly what the music is somehow talking about. In fact, can't really talk about it, but it's like you are suspended in this space of listening, this resonance of what humanity
lets
is
music
about.
speak by itself, without the author. So
perhaps you could just play a bit at the end and then we will end, or do you think that's too mean?
Yeah, well... This is again something that he took from the further development of Waldstein, of this idea. Music describing what is extra musical, the lights, the colors, the fabrics, water, fire, air, gas, things like that.
Yes, yes, and taking it, you know, it's kind of taking something as it were old or something that from the past, an object from the past, and then kind of transforming it in a way, I don't know how to describe it, that sort of is almost luminescent, right? It's almost like the object shines forth. We were talking about that with how the end of the Diabelli variations is the same, right? With the minuet, that bit of rubbish that Diabelli gave Beethoven suddenly becomes this extraordinary treasure that almost has an inner light within that sort of shines in that extraordinary luminous way. Yeah. Oh, Konstantin. That was a wonderful conversation. Yes. Thank you so much for your time and extraordinary talent that you have to be able to pull out all these wonderful moments out of your enormous repertoire of works, and your insight into Beethoven is tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you very much.